welcome to Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm MaryLee Moulton, your host. Each program we talk about important public policy issues, and we hope you'll discuss these issues, and at election time you'll be ready to go and vote. Our guest today is Laura Ebke. Laura is the Platte Institute's Senior Fellow for Job Licensing Reform, assisting policymakers and the public as the Nebraska legislature implements the new Occupational Board Reform Act. The act is Nebraska's first comprehensive review of the state's job licensing laws and is a law Laura Ebke sponsored as a Nebraska state senator. Laura holds a PhD in politics from the University of Nebraska and was a member of the Nebraska legislature from 2014 to 2018 and served as the chair of the legislature's Judicial Committee. She also served for 12 years on the Crete Public Schools Board of Education. Laura is a lifetime resident, growing up in Fairbury and graduating from the class of 1980. She's resided in Crete for 24 years. Thanks for being with us, Laura.
Well, thanks for having me today.
Yes. Well, let's start off. Can you tell us a little bit about the Platte Institute and your job there as a senior fellow for licensing reform?
Sure. Well, the Platte Institute is a free market think tank. It was founded about 12 years ago. Our goal at the Platte Institute is to help implement policies that remove barriers to employment and economic success in Nebraska. So, we have a focus on free markets and less regulation, obviously, but we have recently, over the years, the Platte Institute was more of a white paper mill. Mm-hmm. Today they've become more of a hands-on. We have a director of government affairs that actually works with legislators.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Can you tell the audience what is occupational licensing, how you became interested in it, and how it became your priority in the Nebraska legislature?
Sure. Occupational licensing at its very core, at the very basic level, is a government permission slip. And it's a permission slip that you have to have. If you're required to have a license, you have to have that license before you can practice a particular occupation or profession. We think about things, in terms of licenses for doctors and lawyers and things like that, but there are lots of different kinds of licenses, a lot of licenses, and some we'd probably be a little bit surprised about. But that's a permission slip, and you can receive fairly significant penalties in some cases if you practice without a license. In some cases, it's a third-degree felony,
wow.
Which means you could be in jail for 5 years.
So who oversees licensing in Nebraska?
Well, lots of people. The legislature creates the licenses, but what happens is that the legislature gives out gives authority to other agencies, executive agencies to oversee the licenses. And then what we have licensing boards. And licensing boards are typically made up of people who are either in the profession already. They occasionally have, they're supposed to have at least one lay person, one person who's not part of the occupation, but then they meet and determine, what the regulations are, make sure that people have, met the regulations before they grant the licenses.
Okay. Now, how is a license different from a certificate?
Yeah. You can have a government certificate, but a lot of times you have certificates that are more private-based. Okay, so a certificate is just another type of credential, and you can have a certificate without a license, and you can have a license without a certificate. A certificate is a lesser level. You don't necessarily have to have it, but it shows that you have a credential to do something.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then what about being bonded and insured? Is that similar to licensing?
Well, it's another option for folks who are trying to get into an occupation, another way to regulate, to make sure that you're protecting the public health, safety, and welfare. Bonding and insuring just makes sure that you have relieved, provided some level of relief from liability for something that the person does, the practitioner does that's wrong. Sometimes you have bonding and licensing, of people who are also licensed. So,
Do you always have to be bonded and licensed if you have, or bonded and insured if you have a license for something?
Not always, but it's probably not a bad idea. I mean, for instance, a doctor has a license, but they're not going to be bonded, but they will be insured.
Okay.
So.
Okay. So occupational licensing expanded from 5% in the 1950s to about a quarter of all employees today. So explain how this happened. How did so much licensing, how did it become so dominant?
Well, I mean, I think that there's a couple of reasons. For one thing, you know, there's a certain level of prestige that goes along with a license. You know, people thought, well, doctors and lawyers have licenses, so maybe we should have a license, and that makes our occupation more, you know, more prestigious, or gives it more credibility. And so you have this over the years, you've had a lot of licenses expanded. You know, the question whether or not we need to run right to licenses is the one that, you know, I deal with a lot. Should everything be licensed, or can we, you know, regulate in some lesser manner for the good of the public?
Okay. So how do occupational licenses ensure employee opportunities, specifically on wages and employment and prices for consumers?
Yeah, well, it depends on the license, for sure. In many ways, if you have to get a license, let me give you an example of a hairdresser, you know, a cosmetologist. Cosmetologists in Nebraska need to get something like 2,000 hours of training. They have to go to school to do it. It costs a lot of money. And so what the licensing board, you know, has done is that it's increased the cost of entry because they require those extra hours. So it makes it tougher for people to enter because it costs money to get into the profession. But then what it also does is it reduces the number of people that are in the occupation, so it increases the cost to the consumer. You know, it's just a matter of markets that if you have fewer practitioners, you know, the cost to get into those practitioners is going to be higher.
Okay. So when you were in the legislature, you sponsored LB 299, which was the Occupational Board Reform Act. It was signed into law by the governor. Can you tell us about how this bill proceeded through the legislature, kind of what the progress was, and what kind of opposition it faced?
Yeah, you know, I thought that in the Nebraska legislature, you know, I mean, it's a fairly conservative body. I would have thought that reducing regulation would have been, you know, a sure thing. And what we found going into the government committee was that there was some resistance, you know, primarily from people who already have licenses. Okay. You know, they were afraid, they were afraid that we were going to somehow get rid of all the licenses. And you know, what we found that, you know, got kind of stuck in committee. So this was in 2017. So during the summer of 2017, during the interim period, I spent a fair amount of time working with stakeholders, other folks who were interested in licensing. You know, we changed the bill significantly in some respects, so that it was clear to people that no, we weren't going to automatically get rid of all licenses. This was a review, and I had to do a lot of talking to explain to folks that, you know, this really wasn't as dangerous, and if you believe that your license is needed, you shouldn't be afraid to defend it. And so we got it out of committee right after the start of the 2018 session. It became my priority bill, and so it moved to the top of the list.
And just explain, how does a priority bill work?
Yeah, you know, senators can introduce, you know, you can introduce unlimited amounts of legislation, but each senator is allowed one priority legislation. Okay. And so what happens is lots of bills make it to the floor, to general file, out of committee. But once you start designating priority bills, the priority bills on general file move to the top of the list. And so if you have, you know, you might have 20 bills that are introduced, you might have 10 get to the floor, but they may never get heard on the floor because you have so many that are taking time that are higher up on priority.
So it guarantees that you get heard if it's in the priority?
It pretty much guarantees that you're going to get heard, especially if it's early in the session, that you'll at least get an opportunity to have the debate on the floor. Okay. You know, there's no guarantee it's going to get through all 3 rounds of debate, but it has a better chance if it's a priority bill.
Okay. So basically this legislation is a 2-step process to review existing regulations from the least to most restrictive framework. How does that kind of all play out? Yeah,
there's the Institute for Justice created what they call the inverted pyramid. And the inverted pyramid suggests that, kind of at the top half of things, the markets can take care of it. You can have private certification, you can have, word of mouth. I would argue that today it's not necessary to have nearly as much licensing because we all have Google.
Right, Yelp
Yeah,
or whatever.
Google or Yelp or whatever, and you can see what people are saying about some place you're thinking about going. And then the next step is, okay, if it rises to a certain level of, import, then you decide that that the government is going to impose some sort of regulation. Okay. So then the question is, what kind of regulation? Bonding, insurance, registration. Think about, for instance, when we have big storms. And you have all of these kind of fly-by-night roofers and siders and things like that come in. Should they all have to be licensed, or is it okay for them to just come in and register so that there's some level of protection? Show registration and bonding, or show registration and insurance. So I think that there's there are lesser ways of doing it that don't necessarily involve licensing, but do still protect the consumer.
Okay. So the occupational licensing can block upward mobility and re-entry for those with criminal records. Can you discuss this provision of the bill that addresses the issue and the positive impact it's had on this community? Sure.
Well, the bill is fairly new in its existence, but what we did do, we have a provision in there that says that if that there has to be a nexus, if you will, between what they call the moral turpitude clauses, the clauses that say that if you've been convicted of a crime, or if you're known to be of bad character, you can't be licensed in this particular area. And what the bill now suggests is there needs to be some sort of a nexus between it. There's no reason why somebody who committed, shoplifting 5 years ago can't be an electrician. Right. And they've done their time. There may be a good reason to prevent somebody who's got a child abuse felony from being a child care worker. So I mean, but the general moral turpitude clauses are pretty common in legislation throughout the country, and more states are trying to remove those. So what we are suggesting is that as they do their reviews, the committees of the legislature ought to consider whether or not there's some moral turpitude clauses that should be removed from some of these licensing bills.
And in reading the bill, I saw that the way it works is that someone who's been convicted of a crime, if they're thinking of doing something like, suppose they want to go and be an electrician, and there's a lot of cost involved in that, they can actually call someone first to find out if that's going to be an impediment before they invest all this money?
Yeah, currently they can't. Before the bill went into effect, they couldn't. They had to, the licensing board didn't have to give them any sort of an advisory opinion. And so what this does now is it requires that the board provide an advisory opinion. So if one of the things that you hear about around the country is people who've been trained as cosmetologists while they're in prison.
Right.
And they're trained to do these things, and they get out, they've taken the coursework, and they've got the number of hours because they've been doing the work in the prison. They've got the number of hours necessary, but then they get out and find out that they're not eligible to work in the field that they've been trained in. So what they're saying, what we now require is that if somebody says, hey, I think I might like to do this, but it's going to require a license, they can now petition the board and say, knowing what you know about me now doesn't, if you do something later, that's a different,
Right.
But given the current record I've got, is there anything there that would disqualify me from getting a license?
Okay. Now, when most people think of a license, they think of a doctor, a lawyer, or a nurse. So what are some of the occupations that would surprise viewers and listeners to?
Well, probably the best one that we had last year, and we actually removed it last year, was the horse massage bill.
Okay.
That's the one that always gets everybody kind of chuckling, because who knew that a horse needed to be massaged,
right.
for one thing.
And you needed a license for it.
And that you needed a license for it. It was funny because most people didn't realize that you had to have a license. And in fact, I had somebody in my district who had been trained in Kansas in some special school to be a horse masseuse. She'd moved to Nebraska, and was doing it, on an odd basis, for friends and things like that. She didn't really have a business per se, and she says, I can't do that, and so it has been it's been interesting to see people kind of come out of the woodwork and not realize the reason we found out about it. And this is why it's good to have the periodic review of all licenses. Nobody knew that it was there until a woman got crosswise with a local veterinarian. And
that's how they picked it up.
And that's how they picked it up, because it's done under the authority of the veterinary licensing.
Okay. Well, just to make sure that our listeners know, we do have this as a podcast too, and we are today talking with Laura Ebke, and she's a senior fellow for licensing reform with the Platte Institute. Are there any other occupations that Nebraska has licensing from that other states don't?
Well, there are some kind of odd ones. I don't think there are too many that nobody else has.
Okay.
The horse massage there were very few states that didn't have that. Title insurance agents, so something like only 10 states have insurance for that, have licensing for that, and Nebraska is one of them. Most states you find that there's 20 or 30 that do. One of the interesting ones that's up this year is an art therapy license and a landscape architect license. And if you go back and look, almost no states had it 5 years ago, but there's a move within their occupations to try to get licensing. So.
Okay. Now, it was really interesting because I found in reading articles about occupational licensing that the Institute for Justice and the Brookings Institute, which would be the right and the left, were both really interested in this subject. And in fact, the ACLU supported your bill. So how did this come to be an issue that both sides seemingly have embraced?
Right.
Can we find more of these?
I hope so. The ACLU was a great partner in this. The Platte Institute and the ACLU both worked really hard on it. Their lobbyists were helping, count votes for me and things like that. The ACLU got involved. It makes sense for the Platte Institute, I guess, kind of on the surface. Economic freedom and things like that. But the Platte Institute or the ACLU was interested in it. They had done the national organization had done their second chance study a year or two ago, which looked at recidivism, people coming out of prison, and problems that they were having getting ahead. And so we reached out to them and said, is this something that you'd be interested in? And they sure were, and it was a great partnership. And it's interesting, there are other things out there that the Platte Institute and the ACLU will probably be working together on in the next couple of sessions.
No, any previews?
No.
You can't tell yet. But that's great. That's what we want to hear. So what about license portability between states? And has this particularly had an effect on military families and recruiting people from other states that jobs that Nebraska needs?
Yeah, that's something that there's a lot of effort going on nationwide in terms of military spouse or military portability. We found that especially true to be in things like nurses and teachers and things like that. In fact, I was on the education committee as well, and we had one of the general's wives who was a teacher who came and testified because she couldn't transfer her. She'd taught for 20 years in Florida or someplace and couldn't come in easily. There is an increased effort. I think there's a bill in the legislature this year to try to get rid of that. That limit or make it easier for people. Nurses and some of the medical professions have gone to national boards now as the criteria for their basic licensure, so it's a lot easier to move some of those around.
Do you think it's possible teaching may go that way?
I think that teaching will probably move in that direction eventually, although a lot of states aren't using the same tests for their certification.
And what about compacts with other states? Does Nebraska have any compacts where you recognize the license, say in like Iowa or South Dakota, someplace abutting us?
There are a few, especially in the medical areas, but then you have things like the stories about people that are cosmetologists or massage therapists or something like that who go across the river to practice because there's a less burdensome requirement in Iowa than there is in Nebraska. So.
Okay. And does the legislature ever look at those things and try to find a way to get them to align?
Yeah, well, not, they haven't in the past. One of the things that 299 does is, one of the questions that we're asking is, what do our surrounding states do to see if we can be in line with them. What we heard, of course, when we said that was, that from some of the groups was that, well, that's just because we have higher standards. It's like, well, okay, but if somebody's been teaching or doing cutting hair for 20 years, in Iowa, why, why can't they come to Nebraska? So.
Right. So let's talk about safety a little bit. So what have studies found in regards to licensing and safety and doing these reforms? Does it affect safety?
Doesn't seem to be. These reforms are fairly new, and the reform in 299 is really just sort of a review process. It isn't necessarily going to get rid of anything. But I think that one of the things that all legislatures ought to look at, and there are books out there that talk about this, is before you decide to actually license a profession, to place that sort of limitation on a profession, you should ask one big question. Has there actually been any documented harm by people engaging who weren't licensed?
Right.
And if the answer is no, then obviously our priority at the Platte Institute is to keep government out of it and to limit the regulation.
Okay. So under the Occupational Board Reform Act, the legislative committees need to review 20% of licenses under their jurisdiction annually. So 2009 is the first year that this is applied.
Yeah, this year, yeah.
So kind of how have the mechanics worked? Have they done it already? Do they do it during the session? How have things, kind of played out?
Yeah, the way we envisioned it was that they would do it during the interim period. The bill actually goes into effect, we had a delayed effective date as of July 1st, so the new fiscal year. We have worked with a number of the committees in the last couple of months to try to, get them ready for it. And we've come up with a list of the, almost 200 different licenses. And they're
In the whole state, there are about 200?
Yeah, there's about 200,
Okay.
well, 200 different licenses,
Okay.
yes. And so they are, the different committees that have jurisdiction over those licenses are starting to look at which ones they want to do. And some committees only have one or two, and so they might as well just do them all at once. Some committees have a lot.
Right.
And
Well,
so,
that brings up
yeah.
the Health and Human
Yeah.
Services Committee, because they would have the most theoretically, right?
Oh, they certainly have the
Right.
most.
And I guess the question is, can they deal with such a heavy load? And then there's a different process for Health and Human Services called the 407 credentialing process for healthcare professionals.
Right.
I know that there was some pushback originally on the bill because of that.
Right.
Kind of how does that all work together?
Sure. Well, the 407 process actually is just a precursor to what we want to do in 299.
Okay.
They do it. It was designed primarily for healthcare professions, and so we made some concessions on the floor in terms of the bill, and for those professions or occupations that have gone through a recent 407 process, they can use that to inform their 299 review process. But they will have, Health and Human Services has the heavy lift. There's no doubt about it. They'll have about probably 15 a year that they'll have to do.
Okay.
So.
And does the committee seem receptive to this? Are they
well,
up for the challenge?
I think they're up for the challenge. I mean, it will rest primarily with committee staff and the chair to start with, and they seem to be pretty well up to the challenge.
Okay. Now, the Platte Institute testified on behalf of several bills this session, and can you tell us how you all fared and kind of what happened?
I have my list here, or at least some of the list, because Nicole Fox is our government affairs person, and because I didn't come in until January, she had already been working with a lot of people on a lot of these bills through the fall of last year. So, LB 12 was Senator Blood's bill. That was an exemption for military and spouses for real estate licenses, and that passed.
Oh, okay.
And so we're kind of chipping away at things in different ways. LB 77 changed experience and education requirements for real estate appraiser license, so it made it easier. Health and Human Services 112 provides a waiver of the fee for licensing for low income or military and family and younger workers. And then, the cottage food bill which isn't directly related to this, but it was certainly, still in the economic freedom realm.
And that's things you make in your own home?
Things you can make in your own home. You can, right now you can do it in at the farmers markets and things like that, but you couldn't do it for, you couldn't sell it to other people in other things. So now you can operate it out of your home. There are a number of other surgical technologists, mobile massage, reflexology, landscape architecture, that either want to add licensing or want to eliminate licensing that the Platte weighed in on. Most of those bills are still in committee.
And will some of those, the Reform Board Act, will they kind of play into how people view whether or not?
I think they will,
Okay.
because actually I testified on one and somebody else testified on another one of those bills, and it was interesting. One of the questions from one of the senators was, well, how does this bill play into the 299 process? So they're starting to think about it, and that's a good thing.
Okay, all right, that's great. Well, is there anything in particular that you're really looking for in the next session?
Well, we want to see what the results are of the studies this year. It may take us a few years to get it, get the process figured out. We wanted an interim. I preferred to have interim studies this year. Have them actually write up a bill and say we're doing this, and these are the ones that we're going to be reviewing. Only one committee did that, and so the Business and Labor Bill Committee is doing, I think, boiler inspectors or something like that, but the rest of them didn't. So we're going to have to figure out how the process is going to work and get the list, get the list going. I think the first couple of years will be a little rough, but I think that I think they're up to it.
Okay. Well, thank you. This has been really interesting. I think that you've given us a lot of great information. It is so wonderful to talk to someone who can explain how legislation works when both sides work together, which is a fabulous thing, and we hope we see more of that in the legislature. Thanks for being with us, Laura. We really appreciate you coming to discuss this important issue. I'm MaryLee Moulton for the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. Thank you for being with us, and remember, at election time, go vote Omaha. Thanks again.